I taught fifth grade, it was probably 20 some years ago, and I think my primary goal then was, how well do they know the Gemara? I think today that's not my primary goal. My primary goal are the messages that I'm communicating to them about life, about Rebbe, about Midas Tevis, that come as an extension of the learning connection to the Eibishter, Yerushalayim. That's what's more important to me. You have to ask what I call essential questions. You have to probing questions that get kids to think and engage in a conversation.
Welcome to Homesick for Lubavitch, a podcast where we explore Lubavitch identity in the year 2025. My name is Benzi Afson, and I will be your host. Let's begin. Alrighty, we are here with Rabbi Yossi Rosenblum in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Headmaster? What's the title here?
Head of school.
Head of school of Yeshiva Schools. And I actually, on a personal note, I actually learned here for a few months, almost a year, back in elementary school. And I was telling you earlier, I remember some classes that you gave us on Gemara Makis, the first few blätter of Gemara Makis. I don't think that was the first time I learned Gemara, but it was definitely towards the beginning of learning Gemara, and it was very enjoyable. So, a form of gratitude for that back then. So
it's good to see you.
Thank you for coming on. Of course. So you asked me what I want to talk about. So first of all, a lot of that's up to you. But the reason I reached out is because, like we were talking about off camera, chinuch is a very interesting place to. It's first, of course, important part of any community. You can learn a lot about a community by how it's educating its children, and what kind of importance it places on education and how it approaches education. You can learn a lot about what their priorities are and what they really care about. But I think in terms of Lubavitch identity, which this podcast is about, there's education is a very interesting place and a very delicate place in the sense that, on one hand, education is what's responsible for the future. It's all about the future. What are things going to look like? How are we going to change the future in a positive way? How are we going to empower the leaders of the future? And at the same time, education is very much about the past, especially in a religious setting, preserving the past, making sure that we hold on to tradition and so on. And, you see a lot of tension. I have a lot of friends in yeshivas and so on. And a lot of times the discussions I hear from them or hear about them or about the yeshivas is, we'd love to make certain changes, but because we feel like we need to. But at the same time, how could we change Tenchetum? How could we change Chinuch? How could we change how things are done? And so, I think that you asked me why I came. That's why I came.
So thank you for coming, and it's very good to see you. You and your siblings spent a certain amount of time here in Pittsburgh in our Mossad, and one of your siblings actually stayed with us in our home.
Yes, that's true.
We've warm memories of the Afton family, and wish you much hatzlacha. Chinuch is personally and institutionally, the institution that we're sitting in right now was founded by the Friedrich Rebbe in 1941, Toshen Aleph, the first Mossad that was founded outside of New York. So that's on an institutional level. On a personal level, my father grew up in Montreal, Canada, and he didn't have initially a shaykhus to Lubavitch. 9 bochrim arrived there from Shanghai. And my grandparents transferred him into a Lubavitcher Mossad, which was run by 9 bochrim.
Right.
And subsequent to that, he went to Teredas, and then the Rebbe personally encouraged him to come back and learn in Lubavitch. And so I grew up with a very, very deep appreciation of the history and the past and what's the context for chinuch. And
you grew up here.
I grew up in Pittsburgh, but I grew up. My parents, my family, both my parents were mechanchim. My grandparents were into chinuch. My grandfather, Rabbi Nachum Volsov in Russia, was into chinuch, started Moises Chinuch there, was arrested, raising money and to keep the Moises Chinuch alive. So definitely I have a very deep appreciation of the history and what we're connecting the children to the past and all of that. At the same time, the greatest challenge in chinuch today is to take those age-old wisdom and age-old history, et cetera, and make it relevant to the child in 2025, in Tafshin Pehei, find ways to engage the Talmud and connect them to that past. And that's one of the things that I think about daily. How to transmit concepts, ideas, attitudes, feelings, emotions to Torah, to Chassidus, to the Rabbeim, to the kid who's growing up in Tafshin Pehei, with who functions very differently even than when you grew up and when I grew up, for sure. With the distractions and the confusion in the world that we live. We lived in a much less complicated world when I was growing up. So to connect, and again,
in what sense? Because a lot of people say that, and enough people say that you believe that it's true, but very few define what that means.
Okay, so first of all, we're growing up without physically seeing a Rebbe. Okay, that's number one. So if you don't physically see a Rebbe, to be connected to the Rebbe without physically seeing is something that you need to put a lot of thought and effort to make that happen. It doesn't happen on its own. Okay. It's extremely, extremely difficult. There were certain things, Let me say this. I listened to Farbrengen for Yud Shvat, Yud Alf Nissen, elder shluchim who will talk about concepts and ideas that for them, they just say a word or two, and we all know what that means, But hiskashrus. But every term that for me has a definition and a meaning for a child growing up in Tafshin Pehei, if we don't explain it to them in their oisius, in their world, without seeing a Rebbe, right, they're lost. They don't have that understanding, appreciation, and it's not something real in their lives. So concepts, terms, ideas that, so growing up without a Rebbe, that's number one. They don't have a physical Rebbe. The situation, when I say the world was much less complicated when I was growing up. There was a hierarchy in communities much more so than there is today. We didn't have the challenge of the internet. We didn't have, which is a tremendous challenge because children are getting their information from other sources. We're not their sole source on anything almost. Okay, so children are introduced to ideas, podcasts, people. So we're competing against that.
It's my fault, basically.
That's your fault. But this is a podcast that's trying to bring it back.
Depends who you ask.
If a 15, 16, 17-year-old student wants to know something about something. Right. So one of the places, hopefully, one of the influences is their teachers in school, their parents, but there's other influences as well. Right. The internet and information and knowledge is out there today in a way it never was before. I think the kids are also struggling students are struggling with what's going on in the world. Anti-Semitism, when I was growing up, anti-Semitism was something that you learned about. You didn't really feel it. It wasn't front and center. People are afraid today, and I know in Pittsburgh, we've gone through a lot here in Pittsburgh. People are afraid, but more than afraid, they're trying to understand what's going on. Right. You talk about anti-Semitism as a subject, and you remove from it. You can. It's a subject. I think kids are asking themselves a question. They're asking existential questions about Yiddishkeit and why and what, et cetera, et cetera. It's really real in their lives. I think there's another thing that's different today. In Rabbi Posner, once related. He said that when...
For those who don't know, Rabbi Posner is the one who founded the school.
Rabbi Shalom Posner came here in 1943, Tafshin Gimel, and started the current Yeshiva Schools. Rabbi Mordechai Altan came in Tafshin Aleph and started a form of Yeshiva Schools, but the current dual program was started by Rabbi Posner in Tafshin Gimel. And he once related that I think one of his daughters was in 12th grade, and she was learning in Beis Yaakov or somewhere in New York.
Mrs. Gorelick?
Mrs. Darren.
Mrs. Darren.
And someone came to him and said, the teacher came, she's such a brilliant lady, young lady, I think she should go to college. And he said, she's already in 12th grade. In other words, you dropped your kid off in school,
Right.
and you picked them up at the end of the year, and you trusted the Misa generally, and it was what it was. Today, parents are much more engaged in what's going on in the school. It has positive element. There's a lot of positive to that if appropriately dealt with, and etc. But at the same time, I consider one of the greatest challenges of chinuch today is getting the parents and the school on the same page, which really there's no such thing as getting us on the same page, but at least understanding each other and rowing in the same direction.
Yeah. On that note, just to share with you, maybe you heard this before, but I think you find it interesting if you haven't. There was a story that I heard from, I think it was Rabbi Lustig. We were making a film about the late Rabbi Rosenfeld, and there was a vikuach towards the beginning of Rabbi Rosenfeld's involvement in all the Torah. There was some kind of debate between him and Rabbi Teitelbaum about school buses. Rabbi Teitelbaum either didn't believe in school buses, or he's like, we could use old school buses, and Rabbi Rosenfeld felt that they needed newer school buses. I think that's what it was. And the Rebbe came down on Rabbi Rosenfeld's side. He said, parents today, they care about these things. You cannot disregard their concerns. So I say that not to put the Rebbe put him on the side of your argument, but more, this conversation was going on already years ago. Like that, it's a Russia to America shift, an old world to new world. But I think from what all you're telling me, I mean, there's a lot of, you're listing a number of challenges, and they all make sense, and they're all quite straightforward and obvious to someone watching. Even if you're not in chinuch, it's quite obvious. But if I had to isolate or define what they're about, it seems to me what they're about is authority, right? And or centralization, but same thing really, right? Like once upon a time, the school was the Rebbe school was the authority, and that was that. End of story. The kid knew exactly who he had to listen to. The parents either didn't care, or they also you have to listen to,
right.
And there was no outside voices. There was no access to. You didn't have to worry about the kid getting interested in some other thing. A kid had to be very mischievous and very adventurous to go to the library and find something and actually care about it. So authority has been undermined, right? So the question is, how do you educate when you don't have that stick of authority? In many ways, that's also gone, right? Corporal punishment is gone.
It's gone.
Yeah. So somebody told me, a Lubavitcher, a friend of mine, actually, he told me when he was growing up, corporal punishment, it wasn't America, it was a different country, was just on its way out. And he's not saying it was good that he wasn't saying that it should have stayed. In many ways, he benefited from it being gone. But he's the school he was in never recovered. It was built on a model of you get out of line, you get whacked.
The first thing I want to say before addressing the question of authority and how to deal with that is that numerous times we find the Rebbe writing that our job as mechanchim is to use whatever methods we can to be successful at engaging the students. So there was once a shaila if they should even use blackboards. That was considered modern at one point in history. There was a question if you're allowed to, when you write the aleph beis, if you're allowed to use different colors. And the Rebbe writes there that the ikir is his anyanus hatalmidim. That our job is to find, in those days that was modern, using different colors. So I've presented in Meistes Chinuch, Chassidish Meistes Chinuch, that you're not allowed to use anything, any sort of technology, like a PowerPoint would be usher.
You're saying in other kreisen.
In other kreisen, the teachers they don't allow the teachers to use a PowerPoint presentation.
Right.
So I'm saying the Rebbe's view in general was to use whatever, of course, it's al pi halacha and al pi Torah, it's acceptable, not to use things that are not acceptable, but use technology, use methods of pedagogy to engage and reach students. So that has to be front and center of this conversation. We need to look for ways to address the issue that you brought up, let's say authority. So the number one thing today in chinuch is building a yachas with the children, is building a positive connection with our students. We need to remain emotionally constant. So when a child exhibits or is disrespectful or acts in a certain way, the old style of coming milmaila lamata and just issuing edicts used to be with a stick. It could be with words. It could be with attitude. It's less successful today. Today we approach children with care and concern. That doesn't mean this is not the new progressive method of parenting that we're friends and we're all equal. I'm not saying that.
Not pandering.
We're not pandering. We're not apologetic. But rather we lead with connection. We stay calm. I'll give you an example. One of the most precious things I do every day, valuable things I do, is actually teach. Kitahei Gemara. I also teach the Sifta Bachram. It's a very special hour of the day for me. Everything else I'm involved with, and raising money and running the school, to actually interact with the children. And I can tell you that, when I started 25, 30 years ago when I was teaching, if a child would say something disrespectful, I would say, that's chutzpah, a knas.
Right.
Right 25 times, I'm not going to do it,
right,
et cetera, et cetera.
And that's what you were trained to do.
I was trained, when I was head counselor in camp, they told me, use gevura, et cetera, et cetera. I'm back in the classroom now, and I'm revisiting almost everything that a teacher's supposed to do in real time.
Right.
How do I deal with the child who's disrespectful? How do I deal with what's about homework and parents and this, and so I'll just give you an example in the area of derech eretz. I was actually recording I do a weekly video for the community, and sometimes I bring the kids in on it. So there's one kid who was laughing. So I said to the child, this is the last year, I said to him, do me a favor. I walked over and I said, can you wait outside? So he goes outside, because he was laughing when we were trying to record this video. Yeah. So I go outside to the child afterwards. I said, I had no one, I said, I'm not upset at you. He says, I'm upset at you. So, my initial response is, a chutzpah. Right. I said, why are you upset at me? Why are you upset at me? He says, because it was very embarrassing. I was laughing because kids laugh,
Right.
I said, I didn't see it that way at the time, I said, but the fact of the matter is that, you were disrupting this. We had a conversation, and he walked away with a much clearer understanding of why I did what I did. And I think his appreciation and the yachas between the two of us remained strong. To contrast that with had I challenged him, given a knas, et cetera, which I could have, he would have, it wouldn't have been a creative way of dealing with it. And again, 25 years ago when I did it, most probably was okay to do it then, 30 years ago, because the children they were trained to respond a certain way. Okay, I got my knas, you told me.
Right.
Actually, I don't think it was good even 25 years ago, but it would have been much more detrimental today because of what you're saying, how people view authority. When you teach something like derech eretz, it can't be that I'm teaching you, I'm getting upset because you're disrespecting me.
Right.
You teach derech eretz for the child. He needs to have derech eretz. That has to be front and center of our approach. If I'm personalizing it, then I'm not teaching derech eretz. I'm responding to my own feeling offended by the fact that the kid spoke to me that way. But so we have to, again, build connections, relationships, stay calm, be curious, seek to understand what's going on with the child, recognize that behaviors are just a window into what's going on deeper in the child. The behavior is not what's interesting to me. The question is why they're acting that way.
This week's episode is brought to you by This World is a Garden, a new film and concert production by Yuvla Media. Based on the Rebbe's first talk, Bosi Lgani, The production tells the story of the Chabad vision lasting over 300 years, to see this world as God sees it, as His garden. Combining beautiful cinematography with a live performance of a string quartet, This World is a Garden is a meditation on hope and holding on to a vision as time passes by. This production is now available to be shown at your Chabad house and community. Share the message and vision of Bosi Lgani with your community in a way you never have before. For more information, please visit thisworldisagarden.com. I was going to ask you, I think you already kind of answered it, but in what you just said, but would you, a lot of times people feel, we have to deal with things today, but if only we could be 30 years back, like it was so much better then, things were so much simpler. And that's what I thought. I wasn't sure what you would answer, but then you're like, actually, even 30 years ago wasn't good, which made me think that maybe you're not so nostalgic for how things used to be. But how do you view this change over time? Is it a good development? Is it a unfortunate development? We have to deal with it. But is it how do you see it?
I'm not much of a philosopher. I'm not an ideologue, or I'm the type of a person that tries to deal with what I have in front of me.
Right.
I come to yeshiva every day, try to solve problems.
Right.
And this is what, I could sit and farbrang about why I think, but to me that's less important. It's only important if it will help me come up with better solutions, but otherwise the current situation in front of us is that the children present themselves in a certain way. And I think we all have to constantly be reflective of what works and what doesn't work with the situation that's in front of us. So I'm teaching them age-old ideas, derech eretz, hiskashrus, midas tovos, yir shemayim, all these unbelievable things. But I'm asking myself, the child who's sitting in front of me today, growing up in this world, and we can't fool ourselves. We have to have a real appreciation for who they are, who these children are. Sometimes there's this illusion of compliance, illusion of, I'm going to say some words to them, and if I bring a little of them, they're going to get it. We have to be smarter about it and ask ourselves, who are these children? What makes them tick? What are the methods that I can use that can connect them to what my father experienced in Montreal in the 40s? You know what I mean?
Right.
Those Bochum came from... that has to be front and center. So I'm not nostalgic. I don't get.
They were probably asking the same question, weren't they? Asking the same question. They had just lost their whole world. That was Poland was their world. There was a whole world that they had. Yeah. Whether or not we want to go back there, but that was for there was so full of Yidden and the Rebbeim, and a lot of them came from different kreis in the first place. They probably were asking the same question. How do we teach these kids in this new country of Canada?
That's correct. They must probably ask the same type of questions. That was their challenge in their time. And I try very much to live now and apply whatever I can in the oisius and the language that the children can relate to. I farbrang with my children. I farbrang with them. I try to ask myself, what am I trying to communicate to them, and how am I communicating to them? And then I ask myself, are they getting it?
Right.
You know what I mean?
How do you know? How do you know if a kid gets it? I'm not a teacher. My wife was for a bunch of years. I have kids, and one of the from being a father, which I'm sure is different, but also similar to being a teacher on some level. One of the hardest things is you don't know what's penetrating. How do you know that you're connecting? Because kids very often, at least from what I've seen, is the things that they connect to the most are the things they don't respond. Oh, okay, I got it. They're not. It's not how they process it. How do you know that you're connecting?
Right. So in general, it's easier to assess a milim list. Do they know these 50 words, or they don't know it? Than to
but that's not connection.
Right. To assess affect or to assess connection and things of that nature. The way I assess some of these things is over time. In other words, you watch how children respond to a situation. We talk a lot about students getting along with each other. Let's remove hiskashrus, or we're just talking about how to interact with each other in an appropriate way. And you have conversations. I'll have a conversation with the children about, okay, you guys were arguing today when we came in from recess about who won the game and everything. On a scale of 1 to 5, how important is that machlekes? So they'll all say 1. That's not important. Then we'll learn later on the Gemara machlekes in the Mishnah. I say, how important is that machlekes? 2 piece. That's a 10, even though we didn't give. So okay, there's perspectives here. There's this type of machlekes. There's that type of machlekes. Why do we argue? You lead the children to at least acknowledge or understand in their own world by, you create a scenario and ask them to respond to it, and then over time, you observe. It's ongoing assessment. You're constantly watching to see how they're reacting, or have they implemented those ideas in their behaviors. So let's talk about a Rebbe. So I talk a lot about, like, there's different ways. I'll ask the Talmidim, I say, if you don't know something, how do you find it out? Let's say you don't know the halacha, how do you find it out? So the list, well, you can ask a Rav, then we'll get to the idea, you can observe how someone conducts themselves. Right. Yeah, we can observe someone conducts themselves. And then what type of person are you going to want to observe? Well, someone who, then I'll bring in a story about the Rebbe, whatever. I told him recently that the one time the Rebbe brought down a sicher, a mime, or some sort of pamphlet to Mincha on Hanukkah. There was a non-Lubavitcher Rav who was observing this. He was wondering, when's the Rebbe going to, what's he going to do with that? You're not allowed to look at the sefer during Chazar Sashat, and when you're davening, what's he going to do? He saw that the Rebbe opened the sicher, or whatever it was, during Al Hanissim. He went back and he found out that Al Hanissim, during Chazar Sashat, you don't have to listen to the Chazan. So I told this to the students. I said, so what assumptions did this person have? That the Rebbe is a great tzaddik, and if he's bringing the sefer down, I said, then he's going to use it, and he's going to use only time which it's appropriate. I said, I'm the type of person. I said, I'm still working on myself. I'm not supposed to learn during Chazar Zashat, but sometimes I'll look at a sefer. Sometimes I'll say Tillim.
It's better than seeing your cell phone, yeah.
but if you're looking at me,
right?
If you're looking at me, I'm not necessarily. I'm trying to become better and better, but a tzaddik like that, they get it. They start understanding it. I led them into it.
I see.
And then you come back to it. These are, like, I call them enduring understandings,
It's called patience.
Patience. But you have to ask what I call essential questions. You have to, like, probing questions that get kids to think and engage in a conversation, and get them to a point. And then watch over time, patience, and you're being curious to see if you see them starting to, these are lifelong, I'm still working on some of these myself. But these are something that I've evolved. I would say for sure that when I taught fifth grade, it was probably 20 some years ago, and I think my primary goal then was, how well do they know the Gemara?
Interesting.
And I think today that's not my primary goal. If people watch this podcast, I hope they're not upset with me. My primary goal are the messages that I'm communicating to them about life, about Rebbe, about Midas Tevis, that come as an extension of the learning connection to the Eibishter, Yerushalayim. That's what's more important to me. Of course, I'm teaching them, and I care about the chinuch.
But that's what Torah is about. Isn't that what Gemara is about?
Yeah, that's ultimately what Gemara is about. That's ultimately what I'm thinking about all day long. Not like, is there another homework that I can give them, or creative worksheet that will get them to, I do that also. I'm not minimizing that, but I think a lot more about connection to Yiddishkeit, to the Rebbe, to Torah, to Yerushalayim, understanding what a Yid is. Those things are much more front and center for me now as I enter the classroom.
Interesting.
And building them. I'm very into building them, building the kids.
So what do you think has changed? So there are a lot of things that we're speaking about in terms of change. There's the the decentralized nature of our communities, even I mean, I can't speak for all frum communities, but from what I observe, even the frummest communities and the most closed-off communities are all dealing with this on some level. Lubavitch is for sure dealing with this for many years now. Decentralized authority. You spoke about the patience that's needed, the need for connection. But now you're touching a little bit on like which themes are you prioritizing, or what are you even trying to convey? Not so much how to convey, but what are you conveying? Why do you think that's changed? Like, why is it more important today for kids to come away with these grander messages? Or to frame it differently, why wasn't it important back then to teach that? Was it because you assumed that they already had it from home?
Right. I think it goes back to what we talked about before. Things were less complicated. I think they got some basic ideas from their parents.
Right.
There were less distractions. There weren't other voices,
right,
that they had to filter out. So we were just makabel things from the mashpia who sat with us by Farbrengen. We turned towards those people for guidance and for direction more naturally, and to our parents. Today, when I look at a child in front of me, I say to myself, the amount of influences that this child is going to have in their lives, and maybe does already, is much greater than when I was growing up. And I cannot rely on almost anybody. The better families still have to do their thing, and they do their thing, and depending on who the family is, they contribute, and the community does to a certain extent. But I almost look at it like now, melamdim and mechanchim have to take achrayus almost for everything. You can't take anything for granted anymore. You can't assume that they know or understand almost anything unless you... Now, in a good school, there's Rebbeim doing this year in, year out. But as just like if you're the Havdil, a math teacher, you have to check to make sure that before you go on to the next, chapter, you have to review and check that they got that, similar chinuch. To me, I start off the year. Some of these ideas, basic Yir Shemaim, what a Rebbe is, what a Yid is, what a Neshama is, what a purpose is. I ask myself, I consider it my responsibility to address these in an age-appropriate way when I find the time. And I do it a lot with, essential questions. I try to think of ways to pique their interest and engage them in a conversation around these things, and then go from there. So, you asked me nostalgic. I'm excited about the time I'm living in. I'm excited to try to accomplish and overcome the challenges. That's how I look at it. By nature, I'm not someone who's just going to sit back and, oivei and what was and all that stuff. I mean, I could go there. If I let myself go there, I could go there, but I don't find it helpful. Like history, the Gemara says, "My dehava hava." Yiddishkeit is not interested in history unless the history informs the future.
Right.
So I do it in that sense. I love stories that I hear about how Chassidish Rebbeim of the past, what they did, because that's going to inform me how I can, employ I heard a story of, someone told me a story that someone came to see Rebbe Chaim, a friend of his from all, and he was teaching of Chabad, and the guy wanted to say hello to him. Rebbe said, "I'm teaching now, don't disrupt me." So he says, wait. So he's watching him teach. He asks the kid a question. One of the kids didn't know the answer. And so Rebecca says, "Come with me." And he goes in and gets his negelvasser with the kid. So unusual scene. He didn't know the answer to the question. He goes, gets his negelvasser. So afterwards, this person says to Rebecca, "Well, what happened there?" He says, "This kid's a very, very smart kid." He said, "If he didn't know the answer, it must be that he didn't get his negelvasser this morning." So to me, that was like, basic Yir Shemayim, you know what I mean? The belief that, you got to get up in the morning and get negelvasser and say brachas. It inspired me for months afterwards. I heard,
Wow.
So you want to hear a story about how someone, their worldview or their perspective, and start thinking about yourself, So ask yourself the question, is every kid in this class getting negelvasser in the morning before they come here? Is that going on or not going on? You can ask that question in 7th or 8th grade, unfortunately, in Mesivta also. Not getting angry at them, but just...
It's interesting also that story took place. How many?
I don't know how many years ago.
Yeah, because I'm listening to this world that you're laying out, and a lot of it is something that we all observe, at least from the outside, of how things are changing, and you know, it's basically like the cohesiveness of or the simplicity, like you put it, of the past, where every community was kind of in their island, and the milieu made sense from all the different angles, has fragmented and fallen apart, and now you basically have to start every day from kol yom yubenechu k'chadashim, like chadashim mamish, the Gemara says, right? Like you're starting from scratch with each kid, and each day, really, because you don't know what the kid has digested between yesterday and today. So it's k'chadashim mamish. And look, I don't know how teachers do it, because that's such a painstaking process. It's got to involve so much patience. But I also start thinking of, like, we have this concept, or many people have this concept. I had it for so many years, that, this is all brand new, right? And you just mentioned Berkechain. I don't know exactly which time or where he fits into, but even before the actual communism with the underground Chadarim, which put all kinds of stress on the Lubavitch community in Russia, even before that, like, Lubavitchers were under a similar kind of stress. Like, it doesn't get spoken about much for whatever reason. I mean, I guess people have their herds for other families and so on. But most families, from what I understand, like, and we're talking about Hoib Lubavitch, Geshe families, some of them very close to the Rebbeim, they lost kids, not to the KGB, but before the KGB, they lost kids to the idea of communism,
For sure.
right? So after the Cantonistim, like, this wasn't by force. This was a similar thing, and this is what the Rebbe Rashab started Tenchet Tumim for, because until Tenchet Tumim, it was kind of laissez-faire, like everybody learns on their own in their own kind of ad hoc arrangements, and then they learn Chassidus when they get older. It's all assumed everything's going to be all right, and suddenly kids are dropping left, right, and center, right? I mean, literally. I mean, my family, so my great grandmother is my great great grandmother is Mayashi Futterfass. She had a sister Deitch, I think. No, I forget. Yeah, she had a sister Deitch, and they had 4 siblings that I think that ended up not being frum.
That's right.
All right. So, like, and what was happening there? The old world of simple shtetl Russia. Of where they had no money, and there was terrible times, but it was a simpler life. They didn't know any better, and suddenly all these fancy people, maskilim and God knows what. Do you know that in Lubavitch there was a school opened up, a scholar school opened up in the town of Lubavitch?
I was unaware.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's in the Akdama to Kuntres Mayan. The Rebbe Shab and the Fidik Rebbe had to fight. They came
in the shtetl of Lubavitch.
In the shtetl of Lubavitch.
So history repeats itself.
I'm just saying.
In different ways. I mean, you mentioned teachers. There's one message I have for the community, the larger community, is that we have to celebrate those individuals who still come to school every single day and have invested their lives to teach the children. They need to be the heroes, because they are the heroes. And we've seen a tremendous amount of growth in Moistus Chinuch and an understanding of what their challenges. And I know, I mentioned before, there's a lot of tension sometimes between families and the Moistus Chinuch, and now there's internet and WhatsApp groups, and everything you do or say is immediately discussed by the parents of your class. But we need to get behind the teachers, the mechanches, who are, I think they're doing the things that I'm describing here. I'm not telling you it's not my own chiddush, and it's not something that's unique to me. I'm just sharing that I've had the opportunity to sort of teach 25 years ago, and then be involved in administration and then fundraising, and then last year go back into the classroom. And it's given me an opportunity to rethink some of these things in the current situation. And
how does a school take a deal, like, conceptually? How does a school? Every school needs to have some kind of identity, right? Every company, everything has to have some kind of identity. But a school, for sure, what are we educating? Why are we educating? It has to have some kind of identity. How do you deal with the fact that, like we've been discussing here, and many has been discussed at length on this podcast, and everyone can see with their eyes, that the community is fragmenting in terms of a lot of people call themselves Lubavitchers, and think of themselves as Lubavitchers, but on many profound levels they are different, and they have different ideas what that means. And how does, obviously one way for a school to deal with that is to basically make it very specific. We only accept Lubavitchers that are of this particular flavor. But I don't think that's how it works here in Pittsburgh. And so if you don't do that, how does a school maintain its own identity while allow or work with families that are so different?
So Pittsburgh is unique in that we have a dual program with the Kodesh and with the Chayil. It was originally established that way by Rabbi Posner in Tufshin Gimel. So that the minute you say we're a dual program, that we have the Kodesh and we have the Chayil, that already now there's an identity there which is maybe different than in other communities. And what that does is, so someone most people will leave their children here throughout elementary. That's where when it comes to Masifta age. Now there's a question. We have a dual program. We don't have two options. You need to attend both. So if I want to send my child to a Maisid that's full of Limud Kodesh, I have to go now to another community. Interesting, I'll just tell you that when I was in 8th grade, my father, Allah Shalom, wanted me to stay in Pittsburgh, and he wrote they were just starting a Masifta back then for the second or third time. It wasn't, there had been one earlier. And my father wrote to the Rebbe numerous reasons why I should stay in Pittsburgh, but I was desperate to leave. And the Rebbe wrote but I want to stay, I want to go to Yeshiva. So the Rebbe wrote, and I should leave. When my children were in 8th grade and I wanted them to stay for our Masifta, they reminded me with the story that I told them that I was allowed to leave. So my point is, Pittsburgh specifically has an identity. The dual program is part of our identity, so that automatically says, if you're here, of course there's a perspective of what Limud Chol is and what Limud Kodesh is, but we have an identity, and you have to have an identity.
Right.
It's a must to have an identity. Our identity is shifting slowly but surely. It's interesting that a lot of the Jungelite today, want a greater emphasis on Limud Kodesh, Chassidishkeit, and they still want Limud Chol, a lot of them, but in a different way than maybe 20 years ago, etc. So identities can shift a little bit. You can massage them, but you have to have one, and you have to be transparent about this is who we are. We have a mission that we actually, we talk about it, and this is who we are. So this is what we want to achieve, and this is how we're going to achieve it. These are our core beliefs, and we believe that we try to communicate that to our parent body as much as we can. But you do have to have an identity. No two families are alike, so it's not a perfect science, but as much as possible, we need to know what we're trying to accomplish, who we are, and we should be evaluating you for achieving it.
But how do you deal with that? That's more like pedagogical identity. Like, what are we teaching? But how do you deal with, to put it bluntly, you have this concept modern Chabad, right? But to put it less bluntly, you have families that they have they feel that we our kids can watch certain things and read certain things. Our kids should watch and read certain things. Some families feel absolutely not. We cannot have our kids with those kind of kids, or we need a school that will not tolerate that kind of discussion at all, or that kind of ambiance at all, and that will clamp down on it. In a way, it's become so diverse and fragmented that, like, the old questions of, like, how do you have families that come from Geshe Chabad and families that are from Al Tshuvas, that's quaint. That's quaint, right? That's like that's small potatoes. But how does a school engage with the parents and not disregard the parents, but then also, and not disregard the families, but then also have its own identity? Look, I've heard from the grapevine, some of the larger schools and some of the larger communities, they're having a very hard time, right? Because, how did I hear it phrased? That there are some schools, some Lubavitch schools, that there are days where like the kids are allowed to wear whatever they want to school, like they don't have to wear uniform, like whatever it is,
Correct.
free dress days, and they have a number of kids that don't have clothes that fit that that match the dress code, right? And these are from quote unquote Lubavitch families, and a lot of parents don't want that. They're like, so they go to a different school. So like, how do you think about? I'm not trying to put Pittsburgh on the spot, but how does it work if we talk about it more abstract? How does it work that we, like, on one hand, there's this you have this openness. You're speaking about this openness of, dealing with the child basharusham, and not assuming anything. But if every child is coming from his own place or her own place, and we're starting from zero and we're ready to work with them, how does that not turn into absolute chaos and anarchy in a school?
So first of all, in larger communities, that's a bigger problem. In larger schools and in larger communities, that's a bigger problem than in a smaller community and a smaller school like Pittsburgh.
Okay.
Of course, there are different types of families and they have different values. Of course, that exists here also, but it's not as the range is not as great as in larger communities. That's number one. The next big question is we have to differentiate between the values and the policies of the moised versus the values and the policies of the parents. Now, there are numerous hiros from the Rebbe that a school is responsible for the chinuch of the children 24 hours a day, even after they leave the home, the school, and it's our chayes to influence what happens outside of the school. That's true. Having said that, I think just my view on this or my thoughts on this is that whereas 25 years ago, I would make rules about what the families can or can't do and if their child wants to be in our school. That's less and less possible today.
Right, for the same reasons. For the same reasons you've been talking about.
That's right. It's less and less possible. So I don't think the Rebbe's words are eternal, but I think the way we go about influencing what happens those 24/7 outside of school, summer, our approach is a little different than it used to be. You can't as easily just make a rule.
Right.
You can't do this, that, and the other because, first of all, you can't control it. And the families, like you're saying, are in such a different place today. We still can maintain values and policies and attitude for our own moised that we can. We can dictate, how people can dress, how people, can conduct themselves. That is our right.
You're saying on the school grounds.
On the school grounds, at our events, right?
Right.
And to be honest, a lot of thought needs to go into that because of the fact who's coming in, who are our parents, and what are those policies, and how should we, if you have a dinner, separate seating, mechitza,
right.
all sorts of questions like that. But that's for the school to decide how we run in our buildings and at our events, and that's easier. As far as influencing what parents do outside, if they're taking their parents or showing their children movies, the internet, gaming all night long, or going on vacations to wherever, that's a lot more about influence and conversations and, trying to move the needle as a community in the right direction. But we don't control that. And I think if you think you control that, that's like, the illusion. There's a lot of things that we believe we're able to do and we're really not doing them. Like the illusion of compliance, the illusion of control. Right. These are illusions. And that's been, this generation has revealed that, we've ripped the Band-Aid off the wound. It's not, we're not getting anywhere with illusions. We have to be thoughtful and curious about what's really happening and think about what's the right approach and what's the right policy or whatever.
Right. Fair enough. But if I put that question a little bit differently, if I'm a parent,
right.
If I'm a parent and I'm sending my child to school, and the school is not like like you said, some progressive school where whatever the child wants goes, or whatever the family, everything's okay and everything's negotiable. No, you have your standards, but my kid's going to be with another kid from a family that has very different standards to mine. They're going to be in the same class. They might be friends, right? It's not like there's no barrier of like they're in a different school. Like they're in this school, the school accepted them. like as a parent, how like what is the upside? Let me put it like, what is the upside of having my kid in that kind of environment, in that kind of what you called even earlier confusion, a more confusing world? What is the upside of that? I mean, on one hand, you could say, well, there's no better choice. You have to send your kid to school. But in a world where, let's say, you could keep your kid at home and you could homeschool them, or just, I don't know, just keep it. Like, what's the is there an upside?
Okay, before I get to the upside, I think you touch on something that's extremely important here, and that is how you choose your schools.
Okay.
That's number one. So a lot of thought needs to go into how we choose our schools for our children. If you're in a bigger city, you have more options. If you're in a smaller city, you have less options. But even if you're in a smaller city, there's online options, there's homeschooling options. So first of all, a lot of thought needs to go into where you put your child. That's number one. The minute you make a decision after a lot of thought that your child is in this particular school, it behooves you as a parent now to work with the school to the benefit of your child. That's number one. And to become a partner with the school on trying to do what we can to make our children successful. So that's point number one. Now, if a parent were to ask me, should I homeschool my child or should I put him in one of your classes where there's all different types of children? I mean, that the Rebbe answered numerous times, numerous ways. Then chinuch, Alexander Ben Nun once wrote to the Rebbe a list of, he was a big mechanech in Eretz Yisrael, 10 rules of chinuch. So the Rebbe said the 11th rule is there's no rule. What that means is every child you have to evaluate who they, their unique situation and make a decision that's appropriate for that child. Now, if someone asks me, should I homeschool my child or should I put him in this and this class? So there are going to be milas and chesronos in both. The upside is that putting him in a class with different children with different backgrounds and doing different things that's called life. And if you think you're going to protect him in 2025 in Tafshit Behei from life, you're making a big mistake. They're going to run into it in camp. They're going to run into it in the store. They're going to run into it in shul. They're going to run into it. They're going to hear. That's just the world we live in. Right. So let's talk about illusions again.
So why don't you send them, just to play devil's advocate, why not send them to public school?
Well, you want to.
No,
I mean, that's not.
No, but you see what I'm saying. Like someone could say, well,
you pick the best possible option. Jewish school is better than public school. A Lubavitch school is going to be better than a Jewish school.
No, but what do you say, for example? Is it better to send my kid to a school where, if there's such an option, where everyone's exactly like me? Like, is there I'm just teasing it out. Is there an Is there an upside of sending? Is there an upside of sending a kid to a school? Like, how much is any? Like, how much? If it's actually a choice, is diversity a good thing? And how much? You see what I'm asking?
Diversity is a good thing. It depends on the child. It depends if the child is a weak child and doesn't have the fortitude or their own personality, and they're going to be swept into. It depends on the makeup of a given class. A given class may have really, everyone's doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and my child's a weak child, and will get swept up in it. It's a very personal question that relates to each situation. I'm just saying that I run into parents who think they're going to protect their child, and you're not ultimately going to protect your child. You can inculcate, you can give them strength in your own home and around the Shabbos table, by the supper table, and tell them stories. You can give them strength, but ultimately they're going to interact with other people, and they need to learn how to. Right. And usually, we're not talking, and most moistus that I know of, you're not talking about the kids aren't doing shugana things. They're just doing things that maybe you don't want them to do. Maybe they're reading Harry Potter, or maybe they're, whatever. There may be some things like that you want to protect them from, and you can protect them to an extent. It depends what age it is. So there's no one answer that's going to fit every situation. Right. I think let's not fool ourselves. Let's evaluate the situation in front of that. We deal with this all the time because you have certain mishpachas that come from a different country or a different world where, this is foreign to them. The fact that even that kids play sports, by recess or play basketball, or we don't know. For people from other countries or from other, upbringings, that's like considered terrible. So I hope I answered somewhat, some general guidelines. I'd say, know your child, learn about the schools and your options, and then make a decision, and then work with whoever's there to make it work best and be realistic.
Well, I think what you're saying is that, or what I'm hearing is that the same idea that a teacher needs to start every day from scratch. We can't take anything for granted. The same thing applies to a parent.
100%.
Right? Like you said, there's no rules. Everything's on the table essentially, and it demands a lot of patience from parents as well. Even if maybe a parent loves their child more naturally and more instinctively and more unconditionally, right? But there's a tremendous demand on patience.
Right. So like the option of homeschooling. Let's go back to that question for a second. The chesroinus of homeschooling are great.
Okay.
There's not proper socialization. We grow as people by interacting and getting into little disagreements and figuring out how to work those through. Putting kids in front of a screen all day is detrimental on many, many levels.
Right.
So you're saying, okay, here's the miles of chesroinus. Now, what are the chesroinus of being in the classroom? Well, so and so, some of the kids do some things that.
Right.
Okay, let's evaluate it and measure it and see what's best. Once you make a decision, become a partner with whoever's running that organization to do what's best for your child and to help each other, support each other, understand each other.
Right.
I'm trying to take these big ideas, global ideas and questions and just make it a little bit more simple and practical, so that people can have something to walk away with.
They make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Look, they make a lot of sense. Homesick for Lubavitch is brought to you by Yuvla Media, a boutique video production company servicing the Chabad and Jewish community. Since opening 10 years ago, Yuvla Media has pushed the boundaries of artistic and thoughtful storytelling in the community, with an insistence on there always being a memorable story as well as a beautiful and striking visual image that we believe is second to none. Over the years, we have worked with Chabad organizations around the country, as well as large organizations like Boni Olam, Torah Masora, and Atzalathon, guided by the belief that your story is absolutely worth telling with depth and creativity. If you are looking to tell your story with a video, please reach out to us at hello@yuvlamedia.com. Again, that is hello@yuvlamedia.com. A link can be found in the show notes. And now, back to the podcast. Like we started off the conversation. Chinuch on one hand Chinuch is at that spot where you're constantly being pulled between the future and the past, right? And the family is, where do you want your kids to go? Where do you want them to be in 20 years? and what do you want them to hold on to? And the school has the same thing. And I think like we discussed also, people that we definitely feel at a crossroads, which I don't think it's unique to history, but it happens every once in a while, where a certain understanding of society, where everything makes sense or has been made to make sense, falls away. And like you've mentioned a few times, like the illusions have gone, the simplicity is gone, like the naivete is gone, and we have to rebuild, or at least rebuild or reconstruct what it means to move forward. Like in many ways, what it seems to me is people build something up. Like you talked, it's very interesting the way you framed it with your father and the Bachram in Canada. And America's similar. Rabbi Posner, I interviewed, at the beginning of the podcast, interviewed Rabbi Posner's daughter, Mrs. Gorelik. She grew up here, and the Pittsburgh that she described is ground zero. Like you talk about kids being in chaos today, like that was chaos, right? In terms of like what's going on in the world around me, nothing makes sense, right? Interesting. She spoke again and again about how the bedrock of her chinuch was her parents' love for her. And that's what she's saying 70 years or 80 years later. right? And so in that chaos, that was a bedrock. Like sometimes her father didn't have an institution or a community to rely on. He was the only man with a beard,
Right.
right? And so they had to retreat in a way to the core, which was, love of the child, and that's what was her bedrock for the rest of her life. And so, but my point is that they also were in a place where the world that they had come from, Russia, Poland, whatever, was gone. They started from scratch. Mm-hmm. They built such an amazing system that the world you grew up in, and even in a way kind of lasting to when I was a child. I grew up in Hong Kong, but the world I encountered in America, everything made sense. But it didn't. They made it that way.
Correct.
And then it ran its course. Right. Because everything runs its course.
And we're trying to make sense of it again.
Yeah, like Shalom Posner had the same way he started. And now maybe in a way we're starting from an advantage where there's already the building, and there's a community,
it's infrastructure.
Right. And there's also the disadvantage that there's a lot of loose ends and a lot of opinions and stuff that it's not, you're not starting on a blank slate. And but I think that's that. Like it goes all the way to the parents. Like the parents, like you're describing, like you cannot take anything for granted. Everything's on the table in a way, and you cannot say, well, I grew up this way, therefore my kid's going to grow up this way. Everybody knows that that's not the case anymore. That rubric is gone, right? And so we have to start again. But if I may, unless you have to go.
Yeah, I'm good.
What I would there is. I think it's connected just to move this along a little bit. There's a lot of discussion, and I think I've seen you speak about this a lot. There's a lot of discussion today about mental health in schools or in general in society. But schools are becoming more and more aware, but also implementing these things. And I wonder how much of mental health is really addressing a different question, which is something that we've been discussing, which is identity. All right, and a lot, and so just to put a bit of a sharper edge on it, if a student doesn't have an identity and therefore is caught in all kinds of psychological malaises, right, all kinds of problems, dealing with their mental health can itself become a form of identity, but but really that's not the answer to the question. You know what I'm saying? Like being a healthy child, in my view, is not the same as being a Yiddish child with Yiras Shamayim. Like being a mentally healthy child, it's a good thing. It's not, but that's not the equivalent of what chinuch is for.
So before I address the question of wellness or trauma,
right,
that everybody likes to talk about, you touched on parents and the love for their children, and I think that both parties in this discussion, the schools and the parents, need to do the same thing, and I think that's what you just said. The Rebbe writes that parents underestimate the influence they have on their children. So the parents assume that they're not effective in transforming their children, and one of the reasons they feel that way is because they're dealing with the here and now. They encourage their child to do X and the child's not doing it, or they don't see the child necessarily progressing in the right way. So they respond to that, I'm not really helpful. But what I find, I look at myself personally and I look at my children and I watch it all over I observe these things very closely, that children will go back to things that were important to their parents. When the parents spoke about something or conducted themselves in a certain way, you could see when they're real. And it's, the Karm Divrei Emes, you'll see the children, it'd be meaningful. It doesn't necessarily express itself exactly the same way as a parent, but you'll see those things as being important. If the father's someone who opened the Sefer his whole life, they get older, you'll see they'll start learning a little more. If the guy davened a little bit more, or was makbid and going to shul for a minyan 3 times a day, you'll see the kids doing that. Even if they go very far away and they come back, I've observed that. So I think it's important for parents to take the same approach as the Moisid. Now, as a B'chanach and as someone who runs a Moisid, I always say that, we have to assume that the child knows nothing and there aren't any parents. Mitzidei knew, We try to partner with them and encourage them. And the parents have to almost assume, I can't rely on the school. What can I do to influence my child? I think when we're both, approaching it that way, there's a greater chance that the kids will...
But I just want to clarify that. because it could sound like it's like you're talking about two disconnected parties, and
not disconnected. They need a partner, but don't assume that the other is taking care of this.
Yeah, so that's what I understood. I wanted to give you the chance to clarify. It sounded like it's never enough.
It's never enough.
It's never enough.
The schools should make sure that the kids are getting Nagelwasser.
Right.
And the parents need to make sure the kids are getting Nagelwasser, so that that we make sure that the child gets his Nagelwasser and says brachos in the morning.
Right.
No one should assume that that's something that the other one's necessarily doing.
Right.
So that's my point.
Yeah, no, I wanted to make sure that's what came across.
And try to partner as much as possible.
Right.
But that's what I meant. So there's doubles better than nothing. Trauma. So, like everything else, you have to find the middle path, sort of here.
But first of all, what has changed? Like
with trauma
in your mind? Yeah, are kids more traumatized today than they used to be?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so. I mean, there's some of this confusion. I mean, look, when there was a Tree of Life shooting here in Pittsburgh, yes, people went through trauma.
Of course.
October 7th, depending how close you were, of course there was trauma. So when incidents happen, there's trauma. But those things have been going on for time immemorial, right? I think we make a bigger deal about trauma today than we used to. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, I may get a lot of negative feedback from this.
I'm not trying to get you in trouble. But
we make a bigger deal about it, which is good and bad, like everything else. Children do go through trauma with a small t. And we have a wellness division here at Yeshiva. We care about children. We try to identify people who are struggling and give them the support.
But what do you mean by trauma? When you say that trauma with a small t?
What I mean by trauma, I mean that with a small t, that means that negative events that happened in their lives, that not negative events of something really traumatic with a big T, from a death or witnessing something horrible, right? Not trauma of that nature, but just smaller trauma. Lack of success or not being treated appropriately.
Being made fun of. And
things like that. So that's why it's called with a small t. It's not as dramatic.
Right.
But yet it affects a person.
You can't point with a finger. This happened then.
Exactly. It's not an event. It's usually something
over time.
So we're more aware of that today. Mm-hmm. We're more aware of that today than we used to be, and that's good that we're more aware of it than we used to be, and that's why I spoke before about changing how we interact with the children to try to remove that sense of trauma with a small t, which definitely affects a kid. For sure, it affects them. And at the same time, we shouldn't see a child who experienced trauma with a small t as being disabled and not able to move forward. Sometimes we go to that extreme and, because they did A, B, and C, they don't have the wherewithal, the resilience to get past it. So that's why I say everything, it's good and it's not good, because it shouldn't be used as an excuse. It should be used to inform mechanchos, parents, of how to change the way we interact with our children. Some of the things I spoke about before, emotional constancy, right? And being seeking to understand what's going on, not overreacting to the behavior, but not feeling that I can't move my child and there can't be rules and there can't be discipline and I can't, get them to move from where they are now to where they need to be. Sometimes, the overemphasizing all this trauma causes us to feel that, we just got to leave the child alone and they're just too fragile and they turn into a snowflake and now they can't move. So if I hope I'm being clear, it's somewhere in the middle is the answer to the question.
My question is more, what do you think, at least from where I stand, I'm not trying to pose as a psychologist, but I'm more interested and curious about the question of identity. How much of this do you think is like people looking for an identity or people questioning their identity and finding their identity instead in all these new techniques?
Yeah, I think identity is part of it, but no, I think that'd be oversimplifying to say just find your identity and you're going to be okay.
Okay, fair.
And I don't think that's what it is. If a child goes through an abusive situation.
Of course, yeah.
And I'm not even talking about serious abuse, but they're put down, they're belittled, they're screamed at, and all that stuff. And they're now currently somewhat unhealthy because of that.
Right.
Their self-esteem and all that. That has to be dealt with in of itself.
Right.
That has to be worked through to make them healthy. Just, can identity, down the road, if we help them with identity, is that can that contribute to overcoming some of that stuff? Absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely. But it depends on the severity of the trauma.
Of course.
And it depends on, so I wouldn't only work on identity. I'd work on whatever they're suffering from and try to help them process that as a thing in of itself.
No, I'm not.
If that makes sense.
I'm not trying to, God forbid, minimize trauma. I mean, although in a way, I guess compared to today, I'm personally more old school.
Right.
Like I think I mentioned on the podcast, like when I was in school, I got thrown into a garbage can by my friends in Australia. Typical bullying. I think looking back, that was fantastic. Okay, I think like they taught me a lesson, and it was rough and tumble. Today, that would be absolutely unacceptable, right? And also as a parent, I wouldn't be happy if that happened to my kid, right? So, I personally a little bit more old school, but forget about my position on it. Like the reason I bring up identity is, does that explain why there's so much more focus? You said you said that you think it's more or less the same, but today we pay more attention to it. Is the reason we pay more attention to it at all tied to the fact that, it's almost, I'm thinking in my mind that like if you have like a river that's flowing, you don't see all the rocks and stuff that gets stuck in the rocks underneath on the riverbed because the river's flowing. You don't see it and you don't pay attention to it. But when the river dries up, suddenly this is like all this. What's going on here, right? And so, to me, in a way, like identity could be like like it's a river. It's like it's something alive. It's moving in a direction. And when you're directionless and you've lost that kind of pulse, suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, there's a problem here. There's a problem here. There's a problem here. It's not to say those problems don't exist or didn't exist. It's more how much of this is a function of grappling for a way forward in general, and suddenly we're like, oh my goodness, there's this problem. This must be a problem. This must be a problem. This is a problem. That's what I'm asking.
So, identity. There's a couple things here. You, as a child, most probably grew up with a strong identity, but besides having a strong identity, your constitution was it's probably because of who your family was and your parents were and all that. You had a certain inner strength to you. That's not just identity, but just you were healthy. I'm assuming that. I'm just saying to you. Okay, I'm assuming. A lot of this has to do with shalom bayis in the family, a cohesive family unit. Things are going well. A child like that, aside from the identity, is also their strength, their internal. That allows them to deal with some of this other stuff. You're right. I like the way you put it, how identity fits in. But there's also identity, but people are less strength. They're more vulnerable. They're more susceptible to let's say bullying for a second. And there are kids who go through that, and it's that unhealthiness doesn't allow them to move forward unless you really address it. So I agree with some of what you said, but I think it's oversimplifying it. In other words, if identity in of itself will not solve the problems,
no, I don't think
it's a chelik of it.
I think it would.
I think now we are aware that kids sometimes are acting out and they're just not functioning because of stuff that's going on, and I think that has to be brought to the surface and addressed. At the same time, don't overreact and don't underreact. And I observe both. I observe people who, my child, you can't, and because in 5th grade they were called to the office and they were asked in the wrong way, why they did such and such, that destroyed them for the rest of their life. That's an overreaction. It's not true. It's blaming someone else on their lack of success. At the same time, I don't just beshmet and belittle it when a kid isn't, doing well. It behooves us to become curious as to why and what can we do to help them.
Right.
So again, you're asking questions that are broader and bigger and putting percentages in it. And I like to think more about the child in front of me and what they're going through and how to best address it. So that's how I look at it a lot more.
Fair enough.
And because you asked it, I do think identity is definitely crucial and part of it. But and I look at my own upbringing just for a second. I'm just thinking for a second. So in the 70s, there was a public school strike here in Pittsburgh. Okay, so 80, 90 public school kids joined the school. They were in my peer group.
And before that, there was all Lubavitch.
It was all Frum,
right?
Frum, not Lubavitch.
It's always been a mix here. It
was always, yeah, right. But it was a smaller, much smaller school.
And Frum.
Now all of a sudden, all my classmates, all my peers, and all that were non-Frum, and they were public school kids. And one could say that I was bullied by them. My woolen tzitzis, I was teased.
They came into your school and bullied you?
They came into my school, and they tormented me miserably about these type of things, about my Yiddishkeit. So I grew up in that situation. But I think I do think I was by nature a stronger type, physically stronger. They used to call me. We used to play tackle football. In those days, they allowed that. And there was a person who was called the Juice. He was a famous football player. And when I took the ball, they tried to tackle me. They couldn't tackle me. I was called by all my friends the Juice. Those public school kids, that's what they call me. There's a kid who sees me, say, "Hey, the Juice," and he sends the kid, "Send regards to the Juice." My point is, I was I had a very strong identity, Baruch Hashem, and I was physically okay, and I was a confident kid, so I survived it. Like you, it didn't. I don't look back negatively at all. I laugh about it. But I could tell you, if other people would have gone through what I went through at that time, and they didn't have that, whatever, it could have destroyed me. There's other stuff I don't even want to say here, but I was bullied by these kids who came into my space. And
that's fascinating.
Yeah, I'm sure they had a certain amount of respect for me as well. They, sometimes they'd ask me, "Oh, what do you do here? How do you do this?" Right?
But they're kids.
They're kids. There was someone who recently met a shliach in California. He said, "Oh, I taught him how to read," or I said, "I don't remember that at all." So I'm sure I also contributed.
Right.
But I have no negative feelings about that either. But that depends on the kid and depends on the situation. And maybe children today are more, maybe they are today more sensitive and more, part of the culture has sort of, taught us that we're supposed to feel more sorry for ourselves and not get through these things. So that becomes part of who we are.
Right.
Now there's all this neurodivergence and all that stuff. There's a lot, there's all that discussion. It's good to know about it. I'm sure some of it's true. But we shouldn't get overly carried away with it.
Yeah, I'm not trying to oversimplify it, and also, you said you don't think I'm thinking about it in the bigger sense. Yeah, because I have the luxury to.
Right.
I don't teach for a living. I don't have to deal with kids on a daily basis.
Right.
I get to pontificate.
Right.
But I mean, to be fair, maybe I shouldn't be the one pontificating. But I think thinking of it on a larger level is also important to some point, right? Because like everything, there are the people on the front lines in the trenches, but if that isn't thought about, and I'm sure it is thought about by others, where's this going? And I'm not trying to overstep my lines and educate the educators. There's a lot of thought going into it, but I have observed, from projects that I've done, from things that I've seen, there is a massive push of mental health in all kinds of yeshivas and all kinds of schools, a massive embrace of it. And so, I understand, I appreciate what you're saying, which is, and I think it kind of goes back to one of the things you started off with, which is the ultimate goal is anyanus, interest, right? The goal, at least from what I'm picking up from you, is mental health awareness or dealing with mental health is not the end unto itself, right? The end unto itself is that the child should come away interested positively in Yiddishkeit, right? And want to continue this and have children and teach them and push it forward. That's what it's all about, right? And I guess the struggle, like everything, is how do you absorb new techniques and new ideas without getting carried away with them and letting that dominate the culture? Because, like you said, in today's culture, it has become a dominant force, although I think it's receding a little bit today, but it has become dominant. And I think the way you framed it, or the way that I guess the Rebbe framed it back then, is that you always have to remember what the end goal is.
Right. Let's take anxiety, just one other area for a second here. It's important to think about this. So there's very unhealthy anxiety, 100%, that must be treated.
Right.
But what's interesting thing is that the level of anxiety in the United States or in the Western countries is at an all-time high.
Right.
Okay. So part of the reason it's at an all-time high is anxiety in of itself is a normal part of life, And there's two ways to deal with anxiety, I think. You can try to just rid yourself of it. And if you don't rid yourself totally, or your children totally of it, then you failed and something's wrong. And so you throw in the pharmaceutical, and then now what do I do? Or you can say, yeah, that happens sometimes when things are a little rough, our anxiety levels raise, almost to normalize it to a certain extent. Help the children understand, be aware of it, that's what they're feeling, and help them recognize that, that's what happens sometimes, and that's okay.
Right.
That's okay. If it's not an unhealthy level of things, right?
Yes.
Not all issues in life can be solved with medicine or with a doctor, that just doesn't how life innately or naturally has ebbs and flows and ups and downs, and things happen.
Right.
That's also part of the healthy attitude towards how to experience the trauma.
Yeah.
If we train them to say, "Oh, I'm feeling a little bit anxious today. That's a terrible thing. Well, how can I solve this?" And I don't solve it. So now you become anxious about being anxious.
Yes.
I think that so sets you off in a whole different place. So that's why.
I know people.
Others may disagree, and I'm aware of all that. And I'm aware of a lot of this big speakers talk about. I'm aware of all that. We're in the trenches.
Yeah, no, fair.
Yeah.
No, and I also, I'm not an educator, but I don't want to come across as minimizing people. Look, to be honest with you, and to be frank with anybody listening, the one time that I recall ever having like a real panic attack was actually here in Pittsburgh. Maybe I'll go visit. It's a few blocks from here. It was like when one of the times that my parents were dropping me off and leaving to go home. I was just about right before bar mitzvah, and for whatever reason that time was just too much for me to handle. I had done it already a few times, but that time was just too much. I didn't like the arrangements exactly. Whatever it was, I don't think it was the school's fault. It was just it was a number of things. And so I remember vividly the world spinning around me, and like it was real. It was real. And I'm sure that there are kids that go through that. I'm not minimizing. And also just to push back a little bit to what you said before, I don't think that I'm like some uber super constitutional kid. The garbage can I could handle, but that I couldn't. And perhaps the garbage can had negative effects on me in other ways that I didn't pick up until later on in life. And maybe so I do want to acknowledge that there's real stuff that goes on for kids, and it's not only the massive scandals that you hear about, but things that are very quiet and that you don't hear about, and God forbid to minimize it. And I think it's a good thing that people are in some ways getting being helped with those kinds of things. I think what I was pushing at, which really is something that you were laying out, is that it's what is the end of this? What is the goal of this? And just to tie the whole thing full circle, what's so striking to me, I haven't learned this text for a long time, but I'm sure you're more familiar with it, is how much of the things that you're talking about today are exactly what the Frierdiker speaks about in Klal Chinuch V'Hadracha. Like the idea that education starts with discipline, but not discipline of the child, discipline of yourself. I think that's the first thing he says.
Number one thing.
Right? Yeah. You cannot, I learned it a long time ago, but you cannot, if you are disciplining a child because you've lost self-control, you are A, wrong, and B, you're showing a child what it means to not have discipline. I mean, and I remember this every time that, I'd like to think that more or less I'm in control when I'm disciplining my children, but there are moments where I'm just fed up and tired or stressed out from something else. And I'm like, what am I teaching them? Did I just lose my mind? It's terrible, right? And then the other thing I think, which is also the theme that you've been speaking about, maybe this is what you've been thinking about yourself, but I just wanted to bring it out, is the second thing I think the Frierdiker talks about is that each child comes from a different background, right? Am I?
You're 100% right. And I talk about these things.
Okay.
I just spoke last week for Benos Menachem at an event in New York. It was live streamed. And, the Rebbe Rashab said you're supposed to think about your child a half hour a day.
Hayom, yeah.
So the question that people ask is, what happens if you have 10 children? You're supposed to think about it for 5 hours a day.
Right.
So maybe the answer is that you're supposed to think about yourself. And if you work on yourself, then automatically you'll have an effect on all 10 children, at the same time.
That's a beautiful answer.
Yeah. And that's really where it's at. It's really where it's at. I told the story of the Kotzker that someone came to the Kotzker. I encouraged my children to learn. They never learn. So the Kotzker says, do you learn? So he said, no, I don't learn. So the Kotzker says, if you're not learning and you're just encouraging them, they're not going to learn. So he says, Rebbe, you mean all these years that I've been encouraging them to learn was for nothing? He says, no, because they're going to have children also one day. They'll encourage their children to learn too. So the wisdom is there. Yeah. All the wisdom is there. I'll tell you a funny story if you have a minute. So I always try to think of ways and ideas to improve things in chinuch. That's how I'm wired. So there was a individual who was not from. He actually has a big derech eretz for Lubavitch and Yiddishkeit, but he's a big mechanech in the Welt, not in our world. He's written books and he has a whole mahalach, etc., etc. So a group of us, we're working with Menachem Education Foundation. We said it was Dalet Tammuz, Shabbos was Gimel Tammuz, and we're going to go meet with him. He gave us an hour. I became friends with him afterwards and spent a lot of time with him on discussing things. But we're going to meet with him for an hour, and we planned an agenda of exactly what we're going to ask him and how we're going to ask him. It was advice, like what the next steps and what we were doing. I was developing curriculum and standards of chinuch and things of that nature, working on differentiation and etc. We literally had a Google Doc with an agenda because we were going to his house in Manhattan, and I was in New York for Shabbos, and I traveled to Manhattan. We sit down and we say something. He says, "Wasn't yesterday the Rebbe's yahrzeit or anniversary?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "I think it behooves you to study his work and identify, what was important to him." What he would advise you as next steps. And I said to him, well, here I went looking for advice or for recommendations, who reminded me that everything's there. In Tanya, wherever you want to look in the Rebbe's letters, you just got to keep on looking and keep on looking. It doesn't change. The emes is there, and we can use techniques that that's for sure. As the Rebbe said, make the colors different, use it, learn something new. That's fine. Right. But ultimately, the Yesaitis are there.
Yeah, I think in a way, a lot of times, the truth is staring you in the face, but it's hard. Right, and so we're convinced that somewhere else there's a trick, right? The Klal Chinuch Hadracha is beautiful, but it's also it basically looks at you in the face and says it's on you, right? You want to talk about your child. What's your child going to do if you don't have your own affairs in order? And I think going back to how we started off the conversation, like in many ways, you can find out about a community in how they educate, where are they going, but you also find out about the person, the parent, and we find out about the father, the mother. You find out about yourself when it comes to education. Like my child is going to, like you said earlier, is going to pick up on the things that are important to me. What is important to me? I cannot put it entirely on my child. I cannot put it entirely on the school. In a way, that's a deflection. The hardest question is to look in the mirror and say, like, where am I going, right? And in that sense, I think it's the most important question.
I just had that moment last week, 10 days ago. Our family got together for my Yom Haledes. We went to a place up in
Mazel
Rome.
Tov.
Thank you. And everyone came, children, grandchildren, we got together. So they put out a little, whatever, cute little publication with different things that said, if Tati had a penny for this and this and this, we'd have a lot of money to build a shul or a Kesser shul.
Right.
And they listed different things. So I've been looking at that, and I've been asking myself, what did they see? And what didn't they see? Or what did I think they saw? If it didn't make that list, evidently they didn't see it. Like, you have to ask yourself, what is important to me and what are people seeing?
Right.
So certain things, I'm a very timely person. So, so that was
sorry for coming late today.
So for her, right. Being called and asked advice about everything and all day long. They watched me answering calls all the time, things like that. But there were certain things I wish were there. You know what I mean? That's whatever. So, but that was like to me, okay, I have to work harder. Maybe the grandchildren will see this.
for the next decade birthday, Mr. Hashem. All right, thank you very much for the time.
Good seeing you. Hatzlacha Rabbe, and we should hear good news.
Thank you. The music for this podcast comes from the album Repentance Doors by Oren Sor Nadav Bachar and is used with their permission.